Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute. Hello, and welcome to a listener question and answer episode of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. I bring you today's bonus episode as a preview of a brand new monthly feature the Omohundro Institute and I are rolling out to help thank subscribers to our new subscription program. Starting today, you can help support Ben Franklin's World by joining a new program where for less than $3 per episode, you can help us bring exciting new historical scholarship right to your ears. And in exchange for your support, you'll receive a monthly bonus episode just like this one, where a guest expert will answer your questions about early American history. Plus, starting today, you'll also get access to ad-free versions of each new episode. That's right, subscribers to our new subscription program will never have to hear another mid-roll ad again. Now, as you've heard, the Omohundro Institute and I like to provide you with deep dives into early American history in each episode. But did you know that it takes us roughly 1 hour of labor to produce each minute you hear on this podcast? Yeah, it takes a lot of time and resources to produce Ben Franklin's World, and we could really use your help to keep it going. Which is why we're asking you to join us and help support the show. For less than you would typically pay to visit your favorite history museum each month, you can help us deliver several thought-provoking conversations with today's top historians. So, become a subscriber, join our subscription program, benfranklinsworld.com/subscribe, and help us continue to bring exciting new historical scholarship right to your ears. Join us, benfranklinsworld.com/subscribe. Okay, if you'll remember back to episode 207, we spoke with Nick Bunker about the life of young Benjamin Franklin. Now, during our conversation, we explored the English roots of the Franklin family, Ben's boyhood and education in Boston, and details about the printing business and empire Ben Franklin built. Well, you asked several questions about Ben Franklin's early life that Nick and I just couldn't talk about in our larger conversation. So Nick kindly stayed behind after our official interview, and he recorded answers to your interesting questions. So now, without further ado, here is award-winning historian Nick Bunker answering your questions about the life of young Benjamin Franklin. Nick, thank you so much for sticking around and answering more of our questions. Now, Laura has a question about William Franklin. She'd like to know how Benjamin Franklin's prominent career as a printer and later as a scientist and diplomat may have shaped William Franklin and his later political beliefs. So could you tell us a bit about Benjamin's son, William Franklin, and whether anyone in Benjamin's social or professional networks played any role in shaping what would become William's very different politics by the American Revolution?
Well, it's a rather sad story. I think the story of William Franklin, born, 1731, died 1830, I think it was. Now, William Franklin was in his own right a talented individual, and he had an interesting, indeed fascinating life. I mean, his active career beginning when he was just 16, when he was an ensign in the regiments that were sent up in the late 1740s to defend the frontier in New York against the French and the Indians. And then, of course, he worked closely with his father on the electrical experiments. He went with his father to England in 1757, stayed there, and so he acted as a kind of assistant in some of Franklin's diplomatic maneuverings and so on, and then eventually became colonial governor of New Jersey in 1770 or so. So he was a talented individual, but one gets a sense that he never fully entered into, I think, some of Franklin's ideas. And I see him as somebody who didn't fully appreciate exactly how important it was for Franklin to put together all the different aspects of his career. And the underlying problem there really was that ultimately William Franklin could not see the need for the struggle against Great Britain. I mean, he was somebody who was a loyalist during the Revolutionary War, a very dynamic and very prominent loyalist. And he'd never been able to see, as Franklin did, the connection between science, between republicanism, between democracy and so on, and independence. He just couldn't see the connection between them. So I think there was a sense in which he didn't really fully understand actually what his father had been doing. But similarly, it has to be said that Franklin himself was an unforgiving father. And it is a rather sad and pretty tragic story, actually, to sort of read about the estrangement of the two. And of course, William Franklin ended up living in obscurity and what seems to have been poverty in London, which is, as I say, is a rather sad kind of end to what might have been, in other circumstances, a brilliant career.
James wonders about Benjamin Franklin's dual identity as both a Bostonian and as a Philadelphian. Specifically, James is curious if Franklin's boyhood in Boston allowed him to meet any of the future revolutionaries he'd later encounter at the Continental Congresses, and whether the Massachusetts delegates to those congresses may have thought that they could count on Ben Franklin's support given his roots in their colony.
Well, I have to say, I think the relationship between Benjamin Franklin and Boston could best be described as rather distant, actually. After Franklin came back to Philadelphia from London in 1726, he didn't visit Boston, as far as we know, until 1733. And then he left another 10 years until 1743 before he went again. And then another 3 years till 1746 before the third visit. So he wasn't particularly enthusiastic about going back to Boston. And the other difficulty really was simply the generational issue, which is that Franklin was much older than the other American revolutionaries. I mean, as much as 30, 40 years older. And so he didn't really have personal contacts with the people who were going to become the leaders of the movement in Boston after the Stamp Act and so on. For example, I don't think Franklin really knew John Hancock at all, actually, until he returned to America in 1775. Of course, he famously didn't get on with Samuel Adams. So these relationships are not terribly close. The person who was really Franklin's link man in Boston in the earlier 1770s was a chap called Thomas Cushing, who was the Speaker of the Massachusetts House of Representatives. That was the person through whom Benjamin Franklin had his connections to Boston. But he's not someone you think of as being one of the sort of front-rank revolutionaries. So, as I say, Franklin really became very much a kind of adopted Philadelphian. I mean, Philadelphia was the town that was really much more amenable to him, not least because of the Quaker element in Philadelphia. I mean, Philadelphia was a town that was always committed to religious freedom in a much more open and much more generous fashion than Boston was. I think that was something that suited Franklin down to the ground. And also, you see, Philadelphia was economically much more dynamic than Boston. Boston had reached a stage of kind of degree of stagnation by the middle of the 18th century, whereas Philadelphia was always forging ahead, because Philadelphia, you see, it was a direct gateway, if you like, towards the West, whereas Boston really wasn't.
Well, that's really curious. What was Franklin's issue with Samuel Adams? Why didn't he and Adams get along?
It's not something I'm a great expert on, actually, but when you read the correspondence of Samuel Adams, it's quite entertaining about him, Franklin. I mean, he had to give a degree of admiration to Franklin, but it was very grudging. I think the problem was that Franklin had been in England too long, and Adams had not been entirely sure during the period immediately preceding Lexington, during that period and the period around the Boston Tea Party, hadn't been entirely sure whose side Franklin was on. One of the things I looked at in my previous book, Emperor on the Edge, was this point that prior to the Boston Tea Party, although Franklin was in communication with Massachusetts via Thomas Cushing, because of course Franklin was actually the agent for the Massachusetts House of Representatives, Franklin sort of got a bit detached, and during 1772, 73, at a crucial moment, Franklin kind of slightly took his eye off the ball in terms of colonial affairs. And my feeling is that Adams really didn't feel that Franklin was really on top of his job at that point. But it's not really a subject on which I'm the greatest expert in the world.
Now, during our larger conversation in episode 207, you noted that Franklin was a very precocious reader when he was a boy and young man, and Chris and Marcia would like to know more about Franklin's reading habits and zest for knowledge. So, is it true that Franklin was largely self-taught? And if so, what books did he read that taught him what he needed and wanted to know?
Well, he did have a lot of help from his father, I think. I mean, because he had his 2 years of formal education at grammar school and at Brownell School. And of course, his father was someone who's very keen on educating his children too. But yes, his reading was very, very extensive and very dedicated. Now, the books that Franklin refers to with most admiration in the autobiography are quite revealing. The author he greatly admired in his teens was the English author Joseph Addison, the author of, with a chap called Richard Steele, The Spectator, which was actually a magazine published in England in about 1710, 1711. And that was then bound into volumes, and Franklin was an avid reader of it. Now, Addison is a writer that nobody rereads today. But in the 18th and 19th centuries, Joseph Addison was regarded as one of the great masters of English prose style. And indeed, I would honestly recommend anyone to read The Spectator and to get hold of a copy of it. Copies of The Spectator are always very easy to get hold of because there are so many in used bookstores because it was so popular until the early 20th century. There are tons and tons of old copies that you can always find in a used bookstore. The Spectator is an extremely well-written work. The prose style is very, very sophisticated. It's very, very easy to read. It's very elegant indeed. And what Addison did was he was a very learned individual. I mean, he knew Latin and Greek and so on and so forth, and he could write about learned subjects. but he could do it in a very accessible, readable way with a very light touch, learning lightly warm, so to speak. And I think that was what Franklin liked about it. And The Spectator became enormously influential on English writers in the 18th century. And people like Dickens, for example, also went on to read it. I mean, the English author I think who probably most resembles Franklin is Charles Dickens, actually. And Dickens was reared on the same kind of authors that Franklin was. The other author, of course, Franklin was very keen on was Daniel Defoe. Robinson Crusoe, Daniel Defoe's other novels, those were tremendously important to Franklin as they were to Dickens. But another writer that Franklin mentions was Plutarch, the Greek historian and biographer, who was translated into English at the end of the 17th century. And that's very interesting too, because Plutarch's lives are full of all these stories of Roman heroes and also Roman tragic figures. It's full of heroes who often have a tragic flaw and so on. So in these works by Plutarch, the Greek historian, Franklin could kind of get, if you like, is a huge source book of discussions of politics, public life, and about virtue, about courage, and also about corruption, all sorts of different subjects, which Franklin actually, I think, could draw upon when it came to his political career. So those authors, really, Addison, Defoe, and Plutarch, I think the three that are really crucial for him. In addition to that, of course, he also had a huge amount of philosophical reading, which is a lot more technical. And that's actually one of the most impressive things, the fact that by the age of about 20, he'd already mastered an awful lot of very technical philosophical material of a kind that still went on being used in universities in Britain until the 20th century.
You mentioned Addison, Defoe, and Plutarch, and Chris is curious about how Franklin used those authors' language and style to create and craft his own writing voice and style.
Well, he wrote pastiches of Joseph Addison. This is more or less what every writer has to do, I think, when you're starting out. I mean, if you want to learn how to write, you just have to write pastiche of great authors. And Franklin actually tells us in his autobiography what he did with Addison's prose style. What he would do is he would study one of Addison's essays, and then he would write a kind of a précis on it, and then he would go away and try to rewrite it himself in the style of Addison. So if you like, he could kind of master the particular kind of idioms, the particular kind of rhythms, the particular kind of sentence construction that Addison used to use. Now, this is quite a rigorous kind of form of self-education, but he did it. I mean, he really wanted to master the kind of the rhythm and the flow of English syntax, English grammar, and also to acquire wide vocabulary. That's another thing. Franklin also tried writing verse when he was in his teens. And there's a good reason for doing that because, of course, when you're writing verse and you're trying to create rhymes and you're trying to get the meter right, you actually have to have a very diverse vocabulary. And so Franklin deliberately went out of his way to try and build up the range of words that he would have regularly to his fingertips, so to speak. And I think that's something which is very interesting too. It was a very deliberate process on Franklin's part. This is something which, I mean, no one would do now because these days we tend to think that writing should be spontaneous, that it should be kind of expression of one's inner self, as it were. And Franklin wouldn't necessarily have seen it like that. He would have seen it much more as writing being a question of like mastering a kind of form of rhetoric which you could use to convince people, not necessarily a kind of expression of his kind of inner torments and so on. And Franklin was actually pretty reticent in his writing about his inner torments. He was really much more of a kind of rhetorical writer rather than someone who wanted to talk about his inner life.
Lastly, Leslie has a question about Franklin's family. She'd like to know more about Franklin's siblings. So would you tell us who Franklin's siblings were and what kinds of interactions he would have had with them as their youngest brother?
Well, there are an enormous number, you see. I mean, this is a very important point. That, of course, as I was saying earlier in the podcast, infant mortality was a lot worse in England than it was in America. Longevity was better in America, so families were bigger in America than they were in England. And Josiah Franklin altogether had 17 children. Now, 4 of them died in infancy, but even so, 13 survived. So Franklin had 12 brothers and sisters who survived to adulthood. So that's an awful lot. And what that means is that he also had a lot of nephews and great-nephews and so forth. If you look at his siblings, or of those who survived infancy, there was only one who didn't get married as far as we know. That was Josiah Jr. And Josiah Jr. went to sea and was lost at sea in about 1715. So he never had any offspring as far as we know. But the others mostly had children. And there was one particular of his siblings, his sister Sarah Davenport Franklin, had a particularly large number. I mean, I was trying to count them actually because I knew this question was going to come up. And one sort of loses track of just how many he had. But as far as I could see, just counting them up, I think we're talking about having sort of more than 30 great-nephews or great-nieces. And he also has, of course, children of his own. Now, his grandson, William Temple Franklin, was the last Franklin in the male line. But he had his daughter, Sally Franklin, or Sarah Franklin, who married a chap called Bache, Sarah Franklin Bache. And she had a great many children as well. So that altogether, he had a very substantial number of grandsons and granddaughters. And if you want to find them, there are 3 or 4 surnames you need to look at: Bache, Harwood, Sargent. If you meet somebody with those surnames, they may well be a descendant of Benjamin Franklin.
If you'd like to spend more time learning about the early life of Benjamin Franklin, make sure you check out our full-length conversation with Nick Bunker in episode 207. You can find that conversation at benfranklinsworld.com/207. Now, this special bonus episode is merely a preview of a new monthly bonus episode benefit the Omohundro Institute and I are now offering subscribers of our new subscription program. Plus, starting today, subscribers to this program get access to ad-free versions of each new episode. You can become a subscriber and help support Ben Franklin's World by visiting benfranklinsworld.com/subscribe.